Okay, hello everyone, welcome. My name's Joe, nice to meet you. Thanks for coming to my talk, especially on a Friday, that's really appreciated. I'm going to be talking at length about how to make bored millennials play your text games instead of shooting aliens in the head. But before we begin, if you could please silence any devices and small children you have with you. And if you really enjoy my talk, please fill out your evaluation forms. If you don't enjoy my talk, it's fine. Don't worry about it. It's fine. So, text and video games. It all sounds a little bit 1977, doesn't it? But as we know, text games have been making something of a comeback, in no small part because of the rise of mobiles and tablets, a great form factor for reading. But we're seeing text games everywhere, on PC, and we, as a company, are even making, at Inkle, we're making a text game for console. So a text game that you read on a TV on the other side of the room. What could possibly go wrong? So we're best known as a company for making two games, 80 Days and Sorcery, each of which have hundreds of thousands of lines of words of interactive prose. And we like to think that if we've done our job correctly, then it will feel much more like a playing experience, not a reading experience. People talk about playing our games. And so if I have my UX hat on, which is the hat that I usually have on when I'm not programming, I like to think that our primary goal is to make sure that every word is absolutely effortless to read. If you think about the experience of browsing Twitter, it's similar, you know, you're browsing Twitter, but you're still reading text. People are reading huge amounts of text when they're reading Twitter, when they shop online, even when they're watching a film with subtitles, but they don't really talk about that as a reading experience. And that's the way we think about our games as well. The player goes on an adventure in which they happen to read quite a lot of text. So we like to think of effortless reading as a combination of two things, really, and they're both very closely related. Great writing, of course, and great UX design. And those two things are really, really closely related. A well-worded sentence or a well-structured paragraph allows for a great user experience. And I'll talk a little bit about the writing, but I'm not a writer myself. My co-founder, John, is sitting here in the front. He's the main writer of our company. But my focus at Inkle is as a developer and as a UI and UX designer. So really, this whole talk is going to be a nice bag of tips and tricks, some suggestions on how to improve the text UX in your game. But they all contribute to what I see as the two main pillars of what we do with our text UX at Inkle: focus and pacing. Focus is making sure that the player isn't distracted in any particular moment. It's making sure that there isn't anything that's distracting them from the main task that they're meant to be doing, of reading, assuming that reading is the main task. Ideally, the player should never have to think. The words simply drop into their brain. And it's nothing to do with the player having to focus. It's about the game being focused so that the player doesn't have to do any work at all. It's just effortless for them. So to start with a quick example, I'm a big fan of using very tiny amounts of text in presentations. It means that you're listening to what I'm saying and not spending ages looking at the bullet points on my slides. But if I do want you to read something, I can be sure that if there's a small amount of text on the screen, you'll definitely read it. It's effortless. But to give you a counter-example, and I apologize if you worked on this game, here's The Witcher. So on the surface, this looks like it's a really pretty screenshot. The aesthetics are great. The character art's lovely. Even the layout is harmonious. The icons are pretty. There's really nice kind of color balance. And I like all the icon design. I even like the font choice. But that's a wall of text. Do you really feel like reading it? You've popped open this book, you see this wall of text, and you go, no, I won't bother this time. Unless you're really trying. So let's try a really quick redesign of just the text flow. Okay, that's a good start. We've wiped the slate clean, no distractions. We're going to start by revealing the title to the player, but just the title, and that will give it a sense of significance. Oh, you just read it. And so it goes on. But what if the player doesn't want to read the text? Go on then, we'll add a back button, but we're definitely not going to draw any attention to it. But maybe, just maybe, they'll actually want to, your players will want to read the text anyway and not want to dismiss it because it's just boring in-game text content. Of course, it takes a little bit longer to design and build than a simple dialogue box, but let's be honest, this stuff isn't rocket science. And if you hired writers in the first place to produce really great text content, why not devote a little bit of developer time to make it really pleasant to read? So you might have noticed I've started to touch on pacing already. After wiping the slate clean to remove all the distractions, I revealed a little bit of text at a time initially, and then more and more, allowing players just a little bit of acclimatization time, getting used to the fact that they're no longer juggling inventory items and instead settling into a bit of reading. Focus and pacing are really closely related, and in fact, quantity of text is a really good example of that. The amount of text that you show at a time affects both the focus and the pacing, and never more so than at the start of the game. But other things that affect the pacing are the timing of any text animations you have, as well as the structure of the writing, because the structure of the writing is a really core part of the UX. It affects the flow of how you consume the text and the timing of how you read it. So I'm going to focus on two main areas in detail, and they kind of correspond to focus and pacing respectively. So I'm going to talk about typography and animation. So great typography is really about reducing friction and therefore improving focus. Choosing the right typeface, laying out the text really beautifully, and with exactly the right spacing that makes it really clear to read, and just at the right size, it's all important. When choosing a typeface for text that the player is going to be reading a lot of, the most important thing is readability. And one aspect of this is legibility. What's the difference between readability and legibility? Well, legibility is how easy it is to make out the shape of the individual letters. So to take a slightly extreme example, this fantasy lettering is perfectly legible. You can see exactly what it says. You can pick out every single character, and even in isolation, you'd know what that character is. But would you want to read 50,000 words in it? I certainly wouldn't. It wouldn't be as readable. And this is kind of an extreme example. Obviously, even a game UI wouldn't use this font for 50,000 words of text. And you certainly wouldn't typeset an entire book in this typeface. But game artists and designers seem continually tempted to push the boundaries of what's slightly just a bit too over-stylized, in my opinion. And you see it in practice all the time. For example, I love Elder Scrolls, by the way. I love Oblivion, but this text is not designed to be read. This is basically just a prop in the world that happens to have some text written on it to give you a sense of the tone of the world. But I don't think anyone would really feel like this is really pleasurable to read. The characters, yeah, they're tonally, they're beautifully kind of within the tone of Skyrim's world, but it's just got that little extra amount of friction that prevents you from really getting drawn in. I mean, some intrepid players, myself included, might really make an attempt to read some of it, but it's just a lot of hard work. Here's another example, this one from Oblivion. Excuse me if the screenshot looks a bit low resolution. So that, for example, this, if you look at the initial on the second page, the stylized G, that's beautiful. I love illuminated manuscripts, and that's gorgeous, but it just makes the text just a little bit harder to read. Overall, the font isn't bad, but it's just a little bit extra work. So here's what I would do if I was going to change the font and just play with the layout a tiny bit. So what I've done is I've duplicated the text content on the right page onto the left page, so you can see them side by side. And obviously, the first thing you notice is there's just less text on the left-hand side. So they're not totally equivalent. You might think I'm cheating. So what's the other things I've done? I've changed the typeface to a variant of Castellon, which originates from the 18th century. Even if you don't know anything about fonts, that'll just give an instinctive, slightly aged feel. And I feel like it's got nicer proportions than other serif fonts like Times New Roman. The main thing, though, is it's not quite so alien to your eyes as the overly stylized version on the right. And in fact, the most important thing about readability is familiarity. There's nothing specific about an overly stylized font that makes it hard to read necessarily. It's just the fact that it's not familiar to your eyes. I've also widened the margin, which really just gives the text a bit of room to breathe. This allows you to really focus on the words. So the margins can really kind of allow your eye to just concentrate on just the paragraph and nothing around it. But wide margins can also sort of convey a sense of importance. If you think about the way poetry is typeset, it's kind of really narrow with huge margins that just gives it this kind of air of confidence and importance. And it can make a message just feel significant, even if the words aren't. How profound. I've also added a lot of paragraph spacing. You might have noticed I've also broken up that first paragraph too. Playing with the structure of the writing is a core part of the designing the UX. And even if your writer isn't responsible for the UX ultimately, they are contributing to it. I've also indented the paragraphs. I mean, this sounds like a really minor thing, but anecdotally on 80 days, as soon as we put in that indent on the first line of every paragraph, it sort of acts as this little anchor that lets you feel like you're not getting lost in the text. And it helps you kind of skim down. I should say this is, in general, a pretty contrived example. If I was designing everything from scratch, I would almost certainly not lay it out on the pages of the book, even though that feels very in metaphor with what the player's doing. We'd probably do something like what we did on Sorcery with pieces of paper that slide up. So, what are my top 5 typography and typesetting tips? We've already talked about typeface and the margins and paragraph spacing, which help focus in on the text and give a sense of importance. Next on this list is text size. I could probably rant for an hour just about text size alone. The number of console games that you see with this tiny, tiny, tiny text, probably because developers just sitting next to their TVs. That's definitely the way it was when I was working in AAA. And they just don't care. They can see the text. It's right next to they're sitting right next to the TV, so they don't care. Please don't do that. As a rough guide, just take a look at film subtitles. It's the most ridiculously simple UX in the world, but even subtitles on cheap DVD players work fine. If you're working on both mobile and console, a nice rule of thumb is that those screen sizes are actually surprisingly similar if you take into account the view distance. So the fonts are likely to be a bit more chunky than on PC, for example, where you can afford to have a smaller font. But if you're developing for PC and one of those other platforms, you may as well design the console or the mobile UI first, because then you'll be sure that you've got enough space on PC and you won't squash it in at the last minute. So a rough rule of thumb, I would say, for number of words per line, and this stuff is really important, is that you should aim for around 5 to 15 words per line. At the lower end, you have an effect a bit like a newspaper column, which can actually be really quite easy to read, because your eye doesn't get lost. But as soon as you go over somewhere around 15, it just becomes that little bit harder for your eye to scan back to the start of the next line. I've seen a few narrative games on PC particularly that put narrative down at the bottom of the screen in a tiny font and stretch it the full width of the screen, giving well over 20 words per line. Sorry, Witcher, I don't mean to pick on you. How many words is that per line? I lost count around 30, and I know this is cheating because this is just subtitles, but all of this stuff counts. Finally, the text positioning. In the same way as when you're reading film subtitles, you might find that when you're reading, you sort of find yourself not being able to pay attention to the visuals quite so much. it's kind of splitting the player's attention. So ideally, you want to try to place the text contextually where it belongs next to the gameplay within the scene. I know that can be difficult depending on the genre. And finally, there's one more point that I'm making on this slide, and that's that you can use the text brightness itself, or the color, in order to draw the player's attention to what's important right now, what they should be reading at this very moment. And while also showing the previous text for some context. And this is definitely something that we did on 80 Days, and it really helped focus the player's eye. So all of these typography improvements can help with focus. They help the player concentrate on the text that's important and helps them absorb it easily. And I've been showing some examples of some static pages of text, but one of the things we've been most happy with at Inkle is the timing of the way that we reveal text, the pacing. So I like to think of focus and pacing a bit like harmony and melody in music. Harmony is like the way that the text appears in a particular moment, and how you perceive it and how it looks on screen. Whereas pacing is more like melody. It's how that text is presented over time as a sequence. And pacing is critical right from the beginning of the game, or right from the beginning of a particular section where you want to present some text. I think everyone knows that in the first few seconds or minutes, you have the opportunity to either capture your player or make them just feel that little bit of apathy about what they're looking at. Because text is boring, right? Just as people judge books by covers or decide in the first couple of pages that a book doesn't seem to their taste, you want to convince your players that your text isn't intimidating or boring. So the first thing that we do when we do the pacing for text content is we break it down into smaller digestible chunks, like I showed earlier. The BBC News website puts every single sentence on its own paragraph to make it a little bit easier to read. But being game developers, we can play with animation timing and interactivity as well. So this is really a matter of balance. Showing small sections of text in isolation can help the player focus on those specific words, slowing them down. It forces them to pause and think. Whereas when showing a single larger section of text, assuming the player is already focused on those words, it allows them to consume the content much more quickly. Hang on, what? Smaller sections slow you down and larger sections speed you up. So to be clear, I'm talking about these sections in isolation, when you have a pause or you have to press a button in order to go to the next section. So necessarily, inserting those gaps will slow the player down, and if it becomes too slow, it can become boring or frustrating if the player can't read fast enough. And it can definitely be surprising. While working on Sorcery, we tried making a text-based action scene by having little snippets like you leap forward or you make a dash for the door, separated by choices. And sometimes that works, but we were surprised at how having a rapid succession of choices, we thought it would speed the game up. But actually, of course, it slows it down because it slows down the reveal of the content itself. So what can I say? Pacing is really, really hard to get right. The only way you can solve this kind of thing is by testing and iterating. Since pacing is inherently time-based, it's like animating a character. You wouldn't expect a character artist to produce a character animation purely in theory by inserting all the keyframes and just assuming that it's going to work. They have to keep playing it back, keep trying it, going back and making small modifications and trying again. And that's what we do. That's what we do as part of our core writing process. And as we develop the writing and the UX hand in hand. So I'd strongly suggest that you get your writers up and running with the game and in the habit of playing as they write. And it's also very platform dependent in that depending on whether you're looking on a mobile screen or on a console or on a PC, you're going to get a totally different flow. So in a moment, I'll show you some examples and how the animation factors into this balance. But first, we've talked so far about splitting up the content into small sections, but that's really only the short-term pacing. In the long term, the main thing you have to contend with is fatigue. Imagine a book with paragraphs but no chapter breaks, or a Kindle ebook with no page numbers or progress bar, or a children's book with no illustrations. So this is really dependent on the design of your individual game. So far, we've really been discussing focus and pacing across the span of just a few seconds. So it's been applicable whether your game is purely text-based or whether it's a game that happens to have some text-based sections. If your core mechanic relies on reading text, then it can really help to introduce some ancillary mechanics, whether text-based or not, just to break up the flow and give the player a sense of contrast and give them a sense that every time they change activity, it feels new and fresh. And it's going to be satisfying each time they enter a new text section. It can also help if you give the player control over when you switch this type of activity or use it as a reward. In 80 Days, we used to have an identical flow to Sorcery in that when you arrived in a location, the story flow would just pop up immediately. But as soon as we put it on the Explore button, suddenly that felt like a reward, and there was this much stronger motivation to just start reading because they clicked a button and they wanted to see what the result was. So putting the player in charge of the decision to read gives them a sense of ownership over the content. For longer sections especially, it can really help to give the player a sense of their overall progress. And for 80 Days in Sorcery, this wasn't really necessary because we like to just show small sections, but if you've got a longer text game, that might really help. On the flip side, you have to be careful, though. Sometimes when the players get past a halfway point, being given the sense that they're nearly done can cause them to rush and pay less attention to the text. This is definitely something that happened in 80 Days, and it was exacerbated by the fact that they were meant to be hurrying as part of the main game mechanic. Even though we paused the clock every time you read a story section, there was still this really strong instinct, just as you're getting closer to London, to just push a little bit faster and skim read the text. So finally, let's talk about animation. Good aesthetics can draw the player in. Gamers are used to having their attention drawn in by eye-catching visuals, so some pretty text animations can give them the feel-good factor before they get drawn in by the story and make them feel like they're getting something high production, that feels like high production, that's worth their time, even though the true value is really in the content. To a point, of course. But animation isn't all about aesthetics. It can also be functional, too. And this is where things get really interesting. So this is the story flow from Sorcery. When the player reads a choice, their eye is down at the bottom of the screen. And when they pick a choice, the piece of paper that the choice text is written on slides up and joins the bottom edge of the story flow above, and the body text is revealed. So what this does is it actually leads the eye up from the bottom where the choice was, right up to where they're just about to start reading again. And the animation is doing this for them. So they don't have to lose their place. They know exactly where they're going to start reading from. Similarly, this is the text flow in 80 Days, where we went a step further. Often the choices you make are at the start or an end of a sentence. And that's the case, and when that's the case, the choice text itself can be reused and sometimes rearranged slightly as body text. So we animate it into place and then animate the rest of the content in word by word. So how are we manipulating the pacing? Our word-by-word animation is really quite quick. The idea is that fast readers shouldn't be ever slowed down. I'm a slow reader. My co-founder, John, is a very fast reader. My wife is a fast reader. And so, you know, we just got to keep testing it with all different reading speeds just to make sure that it's great for everyone. You definitely don't want to have to hold down a button to speed up the text. However, we do deliberately delay the appearance of the choices by less than a second, so that the point the player is unconsciously deciding what to do next, they immediately start reading the highlighted text and are discouraged from jumping straight down to look at the choices. Also, the fade-in speed of the choices is slow enough that they don't accidentally distract the player from reading the body text, which is what they're meant to be concentrating on. So every animation detail on a really fine-grained level has the ability to either make or break the flow of your story. When you're testing, the most important thing is to really just be hyper-conscious of those tiny little moments where your eye's getting lost, or whether you just have a little moment of apathy just for a split second while you're waiting, say, for an animation to complete. Our best aha moments have come when we've jumped into the game to test a feature and then realized that we've forgotten what we were testing and ended up just subconsciously just reading and playing the game and getting involved with the story. That's when you know that the UX is working. And so I'd like to show you one final example of one of the changes that we've made recently, well, a few months ago now, to our latest game, Heaven's Vault. In many ways, this is just another tiny, subtle thing, but then I think the tiny, subtle things is pretty much what describes UX in a nutshell. Our interactive script engine produces character dialogue on a line-by-line basis, which is then presented to the game. Initially, we just showed one line at a time, giving the player just enough time to read it before moving on to the next one. Let me just show you a quick recording from the game's editor, what that looked like when it ran in the game. So it's okay, the pacing is just a little bit sluggish here. The problem is everyone reads at a different speed, so we can't really display the text for much less time than that. So the small fix we made was to allow multiple lines of dialogue to overlap and cascade, so new dialogue bubbles can appear while old ones are still on screen. Again, it's quite subtle, but take a look at another recording with this mode switched on. So this meant that the whole game actually sped up, and it just felt so much more refreshing to play it. Also, the previous text that's on the screen can help with a bit of context as well, so that's a nice bonus. And this tiny, subtle tweak worked miracles for the pacing of the game overall, and it's these tiny little changes that can make or break the experience. So what can I say? It's really, really hard, but you've just got to keep testing, iterating, keep trying little subtle tweaks. Pay attention to those tiny fractions of a second where you're waiting around for a little delay or an animation, or those tiny moments of apathy when you look at a block of text that's just a little bit too long. And when you end up reading absent-mindedly, that's a pretty good sign. And as one final side note, one thing that we find is invaluable when producing beautiful dynamic UI is having just the right set of tools. While working natively on iOS, we had access to Apple's core animation framework, which is fantastic and basically is a big part of the reason why iOS itself has always had pretty UI animations. It's certainly what allowed us to build the text flow in 80 days. So we've created a similar system when we moved over to Unity, and now we've open sourced it, and it's available right there. So I hope some of you might find that helpful as well. Thank you very much. And we might have 1 minute left for questions, possibly. Hello.
Hello. So can you talk a little bit about the typesetting and the pacing test iterations when doing localization?
So the truthful answer to that is that I'm afraid we've never been able to localize our games for almost unrelated reasons, that our text engine varies the text on a word-by-word basis. So localization has been all but impossible so far. Hello.
I started with a graphic design degree, then an animation degree. Now I'm in serious simulations for the military.
Well, I'm sure you know more than I do then.
Well, I'm always flirting around UX design, and I'm always wanting to get into it, but then I kind of am and am not, and I don't know how to get started. Is there a UX design for dummies? What do they have out there? Where do I get started?
For me, it was completely self-taught. I've always been interested in graphic design, and I've done the graphic design on our games, but to be honest, I've only actually been doing it professionally for the time since we started our company. So I've completely learned on the job.
Wow, okay, I get that a lot, but it seems the best way to learn.
Cool.
Thank you.
Hello.
Do you have any ideas for in-game, like player-to-player chat, or no?
I'd have to give that a lot of thought, I think. I haven't ever thought about it, I'm afraid. Okay, thanks very much.